21, it's basically being labeled as expands the local government's authority to enact rent control on residential property initiative. And it'll become statute. So it's being, labeled more shortly as rent control. So to be honest, I don't know what all it accomplishes. It causes, I think, more of a bureaucracy than it really helps. So currently, there is on the books in California a law called the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act, which limits local rent control, which prohibits cities from enacting local rent control. And it prohibits any rent control on single family residences, and it prohibits any rent control on housing built after 1995. And it prohibits any limits on increasing rent when a tenant changes for a landlord. So if an old tenant leaves and a new tenant comes in, then you cannot prohibit how much they charge. So that's already on the books, but within those limits, various cities have implemented various rent controls laws. As you know, Santa Monica has, LA has, up north, etc. So there are all over. So that's already on the book. So the main restriction on that, again, was it limits the rent control from applying to single family residences and to housing made after 1995, and it cannot limit rent increases when the tenant changes. On top of that, California just passed a law, I think last year, which limits rent increases in California on most housing to 5% plus the rate of inflation. So that's already on the books. So again, some cities have rent control, but their power is limited. They can't enact rent control on single family residences. They cannot enact rent control on any property built after 1995. And they cannot limit how much a landlord can charge after a tenant changes, one leaves and a new one comes. So what this proposition is doing, basically, it's allowing for cities to implement more stricter rent control. But again, it's only allowing it for housing which is more than 15 years old. So it's already on the books that you cannot enact rent control on housing newer than 15 years, and there's restrictions on housing, how much you can. So right now, like I said, it's capped at 5% per year according to state law. And the new law says, well, you can increase rent up to 15% every 3 years. So I don't really know what it's meant to accomplish. So, and then there's a provision which says that at the same time, the landlord is required to get a fair rate of return. So I think that's going to lead to a lot of, uncertainty, possibly challenges, litigation, et cetera, as to what is a fair rate of return. I don't know if they're going to require landlords to submit a, profit and loss statement, et cetera. So, the biggest change is now that Proposition 21 will apply to single family residences if one person owns two or more. So that's the main difference. So Proposition 21 doesn't implement any rent control or anything. All it does is it allows cities the right to implement rent control with the restrictions that the property has to be built before 1995. You can only do 15% rent increase every 3 years. And you can do it for anybody who owns single family residences if they own two, more than two. So up to two is allowed. So again, it's not doing much other than giving cities the right. So now you're gonna probably have, if it passes, cities are going to start, trying to propose these laws. There'll be local fights and propose yes, no, all of that. Et cetera. And it's already on the books that you can't increase. So currently what's on the books is California statewide can only do rent increases of 5% plus the cost of inflation. So if inflation is high, then it could be more than 15% every 3 years. but this limits it to 15% every 3 years. So those are the two significant changes in this, that it allows cities to implement a strict rent control of only average of 5% per year. So it takes away the cost of inflation, and it allows a rent control on anybody who owns more than 2 single-family residences or condos or townhomes. So other than that, it doesn't do much for any housing which was built after 1995. Anybody can charge whatever they want. There's no limits or anything. So it's on older properties. So that's the nuts and bolts. If anybody didn't understand that, please let me know. Otherwise, I'll continue. So there's more, there's pros and cons on both sides. Now, it is expected to have a fiscal impact because property values are expected to drop, because if, real estate, especially multifamily housing, is bought and sold based on what future rent increases are potentially possible, and if that gets limited where expenses are rising, then theoretically a buyer will pay less for that property. So if property taxes, property values are affected, if not immediately, then in the future the increases are less, then the property tax revenue will be less. So there's no quantification, but it does say that state property tax revenues could drop for, multi-million dollars. And then on the opposite side, it also says that if a developer or, housing crunch will get worse, people will be less inclined to get into real estate and to build new real estate, although I don't buy that argument because it only applies to properties more than 15 years old. So any new construction or new development should not be affected by this. So those, and then for the people who are on the pro side are, beating the drum that this will help the housing crisis. It'll allow people to stay in their units. It gives them a predictable and affordable increase per year as to what the rent increase will be, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the nuts and bolts of it. There's a lot of things being made about the seniors and veterans and disabled. It doesn't address it at all, other than under the general categories of what I just mentioned. So again, main thing is it allows local cities and counties to implement rent control, which they currently can't do. So every city, gets to do what they want. It limits the rent increases to 15% every 3 years. And it allows it to be implemented on any building prior to 1995, built before then, and even on single family residences, condos, townhomes, as long as the owner owns 2 or more. If somebody owns their own home as one rental property, a single family home, this rent control would not apply to them. But if they own their own home and they own 2 or more single family residences, then it would apply. But overall, a catchphrase in all of this is cities have to factor in that the landlord is getting a fair rate of return, and that's completely undefined as to what that means or what that would be or how it would be enacted or enforced. That's it. That's all I got.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. So basically, the sounds of it, even though it doesn't, because it's not a very clear, there'll be a lot of money being spent on lawsuits by both sides, trying to get clarification, especially on the rate of return, fair rate of return.
I think so. I think it's gonna, create a big bureaucracy. And by the way, there was a Proposition 10 just in 2018, which was similar for the rent control. That failed by like a 60 to 40% margin. But yeah, I mean, it's going to create a bureaucracy. First of all these cities all over the state are, going to now start, I'm not saying that some cities will start considering it. They'll have to make proposals in their own city councils, pass laws. There'll be oppositions, pros, cons, all locally. So this state law doesn't do anything statewide. It leaves it up to all the local jurisdictions to start getting into these little battles. And then that fair rate of return mandate, I don't know how cities will calculate whether they can implement rent control and still give all the property owners, the landlords, a fair rate of return. I mean, it's undefined as to how, and every city could come up with their own mechanism. So if a landlord has multiple properties in different cities in California, he could be subject to different rules showing them what his fair rate of return is. And there'll be a lot of obviously arguments and this and that as to what is a fair rate of return. That's not defined, and what, expenses, et cetera, are calculated in coming up with that fair return, and what's a good return for him to get on his capital, et cetera. So I see that as a mess.
Right. Okay. Any questions from anybody? Any comments?
So, I mean, as a conclusion, Deepakji, what would be your suggestion?
Okay, so I would suggest a no vote. I mean, this, like I said, there's already on the books, which state law, which says that rents cannot increase more than 5% plus the cost of inflation. Cost of inflation last year was 3%, so it went up 8% last year, which may seem like a lot to some people, but given how expenses increase, it may not seem like much. There is the main benefit of this is to the consumer is if when a tenant changes, so if one tenant leaves and a new tenant comes in, then there's no restriction. The landlord can increase the rent to market rent. That will be limited. So then it can only go up another 5% from what the prior tenant was paying. So that can be a big factor because rents have been rising more than the 5 to 8% a year. They've been rising like crazy, especially in California, given how much housing crunch we have. So that could be a big factor. So if you're on the consumer side, if you're a renter, that helps quite a bit. I think what will happen is people just won't leave their apartments. There'll be very little turnover. If you're on the business side, landlord side, then obviously you're opposed to it. I'm a businessman. I'm a property owner. From a personal point of view, I would say, this is not in favor of housing. So if a landlord is not allowed to raise rents, even when a tenant moves, it could result in less maintenance of the building, more passing of deferred maintenance, all of that. So it could lead to a decline in the quality of the buildings and the value of these properties. So from that point of view, I would say overall it should be a no, given that most of us are conservative here. I assume this group is more conservative and Republican, pro-business, pro-property rights, less government. So in that basis, it would be my suggestion would be a no vote.
Yeah, I also agree.
Yeah, but right.